going forward. It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this launch of our 2011 National Productivity Conference, and that is David Leonhardt. Now, this is actually a return engagement for David to Indianapolis. He was here last December. He spent a little time interviewing this guy down the street who was thinking about running for president and decided not to. He spoke at Lumina's 10th anniversary celebration that we held. And between then and now, he slowed down just enough to pick up the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his work, writing primarily about the economics of the nation, the economic situation of our country for the New York Times. Proving that no good deed goes unpunished. As a result, I think, of that, David last month was announced as the new Washington bureau chief for the New York Times. And in that role, we were actually pleased to learn at our table, this does not mean that David will now become a faceless media bureaucrat that we'll never hear from again. In fact, this will give us an opportunity to hear from David in some new ways and for him to influence, I think, some of the national dialogue in some different and important ways as a result of having people like David Brooks and Tom Friedman and Maureen Dowd that he regularly works with. Many of you, of course, know David's writing well. He's an astonishingly clear and compelling writer, and I think right now no other writer in America understands better the importance of linking our national conversation about our economic future with our future of educational attainment, because, as David has pointed out so clearly, those two conversations are in fact the same thing. Please join me in welcoming David Leonhardt.
Thank you so much. That was very nice. And it's an honor to follow Britt up here. He left some of his charisma, which I'm looking forward to feeding off of. Thank you all for coming out. I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to, I think, continue it as a Q&A or a conversation, and I look forward to that part as well. As I often say when I'm talking to people in education, I'm the only person in my family, my childhood family, who is not in some way in education. My dad runs a private school. My mom spent years helping to administer grants at the Merck Institute for Science Education. My sister is a clinical neuropsychologist who works on education of really young kids. So I'm the black sheep in the family, and the chance to get to come out here and hang out with you all and pretend that I'm in education is really a pleasure for me. I'm going to start today by describing a natural experiment that has taken place in this country over the last 30 years. In this natural experiment, we've taken two groups of people, and we've had one of them become much more educated, and another basically keep their level of education from before, which allows us to follow these two groups over time, the group that became much more educated and the group that basically has kept its education level constant, and find out what has happened to them. We can get a sense for the economic effects of education. Before I give you the details of this experiment, let me talk for just a minute about natural experiments in general. Laboratory sciences, which I would imagine some people here have a background in, chemistry, biology, and the like, don't have to rely on natural experiments. They can do actual experiments in a lab in which you hold everything constant and try to see what the effects are. But if we want to understand modern society, we have to use natural experiments. We can't take thousands of 18-year-olds and try to make everything in their lives similar the way you would in a laboratory when doing a chemical experiment, except for education, and then randomly select some to go on to a college and some not to go on to a college, or randomly select some to go on to college and drop out and others to go on to college and finish. That would be obviously inhumane. So we have to look for natural experiments. We have to look for ways to study this question that occur without our having to intervene. As you're no doubt aware, the problem with natural experiments is the old correlation-causation problem. Maybe I can get just a glass of water up here. Thanks. In a natural experiment, it's hard to know, thank you, what's causing what. If we have two towns and the teenagers in one town become much more educated than the teenagers in another, and then go on to earn much more, well, that doesn't prove that education caused the earnings difference for all sorts of reasons. Maybe the teenagers in one town were just smarter, and maybe it had nothing to do with what they did in school, but that they were always going to earn more, regardless of how they spent their teenage years. And so for this reason, economists spend, and other social scientists spend a lot of time looking for natural experiments that minimize the correlation-causation problem. They like to look for groups that have been separated randomly. Obviously, the people in two different towns haven't been separated randomly. Obviously, if you think about a college, the people who graduate and the people who drop out have not been separated randomly. Maybe the reason the people who graduate earn more is simply that they were always going to earn more. It has nothing to do with what they did when they were 21 and 22. This is what's so beautiful about the natural experiment that I'm about to describe to you. No one can doubt that the two groups in it, again, one that has become much more educated since 1979 and the other that has not, were determined randomly. In fact, the random differences between these two groups form the basis of the human species. The name for the first group, the one that has become much more educated, is women. And the name for the second group, the group that hasn't become more educated at all, is men. In 1979, 29% of 30-year-old men had a 4-year college degree in this country. 29% in 1979. These days, about 30% of 30-year-old men have a 4-year college degree. 29% to 30%. Essentially no change. Men as a group have made almost no progress over the last 30 years. Find a given 30-year-old today, and he is probably little more educated than his father. This given 38-year-old is less educated than his father. I have a bachelor's degree. My dad has a master's degree. Women have made enormous educational progress over this time. In 1979, 20% of women had a 4-year degree, so women trailed men 29 to 20. Last year, 35% of 30-year-old women had a 4-year degree. Women are now ahead of men, 35 to 30. As anyone who spends time on a college campus knows, women have passed men by educationally. About 7 years ago now, I spent a lot of time down in Southwest Virginia, a part of Virginia that if you live near Washington, as I do, that seems impossibly far away. There is no real way to fly there. You can get close there, and driving there takes 8 hours. It's where Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia all come together. It's where a lot of our Christmas trees come from. And I spent a lot of time following a guy who was then about 30, named Andy Blevins, who had enrolled in college, and it just wasn't for him, and he dropped out. And I spent a lot of time talking to him about his struggle about whether to return to college or not. And I ended up not only spending time with him, but spending time with his sister and this whole larger group of friends they had. Maybe a dozen, maybe 15 people, split roughly evenly between men and women in a small town called Chilhowie, Virginia. Not a single one of the men in this group of friends had a 4-year college degree. Every woman except one had a graduate degree. This is the kind of thing we see a lot, particularly in blue-collar places where men traditionally didn't need necessarily a college degree to do fairly well. Women, in many ways, have adopted to this new kind of economy more quickly than men because they did not benefit from the old economy as much as men did. So now that we know that women have become much more educated than men, let's think about what's happened to their pay over the last 30 years. Men's pay, like their educational attainment, has gone nowhere. The inflation-adjusted weekly pay of men has fallen, ever so slightly, but still fallen remarkably since 1979. The inflation-adjusted weekly pay of women is up more than 25%. Certainly, education is not the only reason. The worst forms of sexism have become less common, not eliminated, of course, but less common, which has also helped. Today's female college graduates are much less likely than their mothers and grandmothers to choose modest-paying jobs like teaching. The decline of manufacturing and unionization, as I just alluded to, has disproportionately affected men. But educational attainment is the main reason that women have closed so much of the pay gap. One way to see this is to look at what's happened since 1979 to the pay of college graduates within each sex. They're both up a lot, about 20% for men, about 30% for women. The pay of workers who don't have college degrees has stagnated. We hear this all the time. There's a great squeeze. The middle class is being squeezed. There's a great pay stagnation. And there is. I'm not questioning that. I've written that. But the pay of college graduates has not stagnated. It is up considerably over the last generation. The gap between the pay of college graduates and everyone else has reached a new record high in recent years. I'm guessing that most people in this room will happily agree that education matters a lot, maybe more than anything else. For that matter, we wouldn't have a hard time finding people outside this room who would agree that education matters a lot. All the parents who line up for charter school lotteries, all the political candidates who tell us that children are the future and they're going to be the education mayor or governor or president, all the 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds who right about now are off somewhere on a college campus starting their college years with a little bit of a flutter in their stomach, as I'm sure many people can remember. I can, 21 years later still. But beneath all of this pro-education sentiment in society, I think there's actually a pretty strong undercurrent of skepticism about education. Jamie mentioned this during his opening remarks. You can see it, quite frankly, from my colleagues in the media. Throughout this recession, we've read stories about suffering college graduates and articles that bravely claimed that education was overrated. You see skepticism on this question from the political left. There are think tanks like the Economic Policy Institute that frequently put out reports suggesting that education is overrated, that it won't protect workers from offshoring or profit-hungry corporations. And for that matter, you see it on the political right. Conservative writers like Ramesh Ponnuru and Charles Murray and Richard Vedder say that a lot of kids are ill-served by colleges because basically they're not smart enough to college, and it is a waste for them to go. Perhaps more important than any of this, though, you see skepticism among people who have influence over the 15 and 18 and 21-year-olds who are making decisions about their own life and, by extension, about our economy. For my generation, the skepticism, at least the way I like to think about it, came via a song called Closer to Fine by the Indigo Girls. It summed up the usefulness of college thusly: I spent 4 years prostrate to the higher mind, got my paper, and I was free. More recently, it was Kanye West. His debut album was called College Dropout. The title track offers his take on the career ladders for college graduates at The Gap. Please excuse me for not actually reading a verbatim recitation of the career ladder, but here it is in edited form. Entry-level position, followed by kissing up to the boss, followed by a promotion to be secretary's secretary. The college dropout, on the other hand, is Mr. West, and we all know how well he has done. Given all this skepticism, I think it is very important to examine the evidence and to be crystal clear about the value of education. In the simplest terms, education appears to be the single best bet that a society or an individual can make. It is the lifeblood of economic growth. Education helps people figure out how to make objects and to accomplish tasks with less effort, which in turn allows them to make more and do more. It helps a society leverage every other investment that it makes, be it in alternative energy, manufacturing, or medical research. Education also makes people happier. It makes people healthier. My favorite book on the benefits of education is called The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, two of the leading economists of their generation. They argue that the 20th century was the American century, in large measure because it was the education century in America. They sort through a century's worth of data, and if you read it, I would encourage you, skip the data. Read the history. Don't feel bad about it. They sort through data like Iowa censuses, and they conclude that their fellow economists have exaggerated the importance of technological change when talking about the vast rise in income inequality. Technological change actually appears to have been fairly constant over the last century. I'm saying change there is constant, not technology. So yes, the internet places a greater premium on education, but so did the PC and the mainframe, so did the jet engine and the automobile and the telephone. Technological change, and thus the demand for educated workers, has probably increased a bit faster in recent decades. But the more important factor isn't this small increase. The more important factor explaining rising inequality is the fact that the supply of educated workers no longer keeps up with the demand. educational gains have slowed, thanks in large part to men. In the past, the increasing demand for educated workers was met by an increasing supply. There was a great boom of college graduates in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Lately, though, the demand for educated workers has been faster than the supply because the supply has been so slowly growing. Professors Golden and Katz employ all sorts of regression analyses to make their case. Those are the ones I suggest you skip. But the rest of us don't need the regression analysis to see the point. It's important that it exists. It's important that some of the top people in the field are saying this isn't simply a coincidence. But it's also important for persuading people that it isn't simply the highly technical aspects of economics that allow us to see this. You can understand this point even if you don't have a PhD in economics. And the story about men and women is only one part of it. I brought along a few charts that I want to show you. And while we look at them, I want to talk a little bit about some of the most common counter-arguments you hear. So this is the Golden Katz chart. It is literally their chart. I'm just stealing it here. And what you see is, for men, you see men ahead of women in college attainment. So this is the same definition of college attainment that Jamie was using at the beginning. This is the population as a whole. You're looking at birth year, and you're looking at the percentage, the portion of the population that has a college degree at age 30. So right there, that's telling you that for men born in the late 40s, who turned 30 in the late 70s, a little less than 30% of them had college degrees. And then you see basically how it dips. That's some post-Vietnam stuff. And then it comes back, but not very fast. Whereas for women, it's soaring. I'm happy to return to these in questions if people have questions about them. Here are the wage numbers about with men and women. This is setting their wages equal to the 1979 level, and you see women's pay rising more than 25%. You see men's pay not doing much at all. It falls, then it comes back a little bit in the 90s boom, but it still hasn't made it all the way back. And then here are the numbers. We're now looking at everyone, not just men and women. And so what you can see, again, since 1979, is that there's only one group that's gotten a raise, four-year college graduates. No other group has. Their pay is all down slightly. This is all adjusted for inflation. This understates the case because this assumes that everyone's working. This basically says, let's look at two people and assume they're both full-time workers. But we've had a huge rise over this same period in non-work. I use that awkward phrase instead of unemployment because many people who fall into this category are not technically unemployed. They've given up looking for work. We've had a huge rise in non-work among the less educated. So this actually understates the difference. One of the responses you often hear, I want to talk about two. One of the responses you often hear is yes, yes. But in fact, if you pull this apart a little bit more and you separate out people who just have college degrees, who don't have graduate degrees, people who stop after 4 years of education, it doesn't look quite so good for them. And that's true. It doesn't look quite so good for them. But the gap between their pay and high school graduates' pay is still near an all-time high. And so I would encourage all of you to push back when you hear someone arguing that the pace of, that the college premium isn't increasing as rapidly as it once did, and someone is using that argument to mean that in fact college is less valuable. To me, the analogy is we're not making as much progress with new cancer drugs as we used to. But that is not a reason not to take cancer drugs if you get cancer, right? There's a big difference between saying we're not making progress at the rate we used to be, and in fact things are pulling backwards. A second reason why I'm skeptical of that story about people who have college degrees is that's basically cutting off the top half or so of the distribution and saying we're going to only look at people who didn't go on to get graduate degrees. But the fact is, if we want to think about the value of college, we want to think about everyone who has a college degree. There's no way to go on and get a master's in nursing. There's no way to go on and get a PhD without a college degree. And so while it is true that people who have just college degrees haven't done fabulously, and that education isn't a cure-all, there is no way in which when you look at those numbers, it makes a case against education. Again, we can talk more about that. The second thing that I want to talk about, and this is me playing media critic, are all the stories you read about struggling college graduates. They are all over the place. They get tremendous attention in all sorts of places. They do have this sort of brave feel of being counterintuitive and challenging the conventional wisdom. I want to read you one of these stories, or at least a portion of one. Sally Cameron thought she had done everything right. After studying French and Arabic at a Tony liberal arts college, she knew that graduate school would help her career chances. But when she hit the job market, her Ivy League management degree didn't seem to matter. The worst recession in decades had pushed the unemployment rate to nearly 10%, and good jobs were scarce. Sally paid the rent by tending bar and filling her time with volunteer work. The story picks up. Sally's story sounds like the kind of depressing story filling the pages of newspapers and the popular press these days. There's only one difference. Sally Cameron earns her master's degree from Yale in 1980. The story that described her struggles was published in 1982. For going on 4 decades, the press has been raising alarms that college degrees may no longer be a sound investment. 2 things about these stories have remained constant. They always feature an overeducated bartender, and they are always wrong. That's an article by Kevin Carey that ran in the New Republic. It's my favorite piece of media criticism that I've seen in a long time. Kevin did the brilliant thing of looking for people who had appeared in the old stories about how college had become worthless, and he tracked them down 10 or 20 or 30 years later. Sally Cameron is now the senior manager at an international development company. Her company has helped build railroads in Madagascar, which suggests that her French degree from Smith College has come in handy, since French is one of the languages in Madagascar. One of the other people that he tracked down 20 years later is now a senior research supervisor at Johns Hopkins University. He also read a story about 2 young women who graduated from college and, because the job market was so bad, simply hopped in their station wagon and drove around the country, because obviously there were no jobs. One of them now owns her own human resources consulting firm. The other, Kevin was shocked to discover, works 20 feet away from him at the same think tank in Washington, D.C. Have college graduates suffered in the current recession? Of course they have. It has been, by some measures, the worst recession in 30 years. By many measures, the worst downturn in 70 years. Of course they have suffered. The whole country has suffered. But they have suffered less than any other group, which is to say, if you could choose between living in a country that didn't just go through our recession and living in one that did go through it, I would encourage you to live in the one that didn't go through it. If you could choose whether to have a college degree, given that you're in this country, or whether not to, I would encourage you to get a college degree. A few more fun ways to look at this. So this is small, I'm sure, from the distance where you are, but you can find it on the New York Times website. This is taking every religion and on the top axis plotting the percent that have 4-year college degrees, and on the side axis plotting the percent that are in households making more than $75,000 a year. It doesn't matter at all whether you change these cutoffs to percent with 2-year college degrees or $100,000. It's not sensitive to that at all. One of the great things you see in this is how incredibly strong this relationship is. The 2 religions that are the most educated, Hindus and Reform Jews, are also the wealthiest by far. The religions that are the least educated, Jehovah's Witnesses and Pentecostals, are also the least wealthy by far. I get this doesn't prove correlation and causation. We'll leave that to Golden and Katz. But I think things like this are important when trying to think about ways of telling this story that people can find compelling and understand. One of the interesting things about this is overall, if we created one huge group called Protestants, it is not actually more educated than Catholics, which I know runs against political philosophy that's been out there for a long time. The main thing I love about this is that it makes people slightly uncomfortable. One of the things that, is it on there? Well, no, is it on there? Yes, down at the very bottom it says Orthodox Christians. The main response I got to this by email was people wondering why Orthodox Jews were not on here. Which I loved getting because it just reminded me how I work in a part of the country and I'm from a part of the country that is different from much of the country. I would imagine New York is the only place where you would put a graphic up like this and be accused of falling short because we had only 2 groups of Jews. This is a second one. This is work done by Steve Rose and other people at Georgetown University, where they looked at different professions and looked at the salary bump you get for having a degree in different professions. So one of the other counter-arguments you often hear is, well, there are a lot of flight attendants who have college degrees. Well, there are bartenders who have college degrees. Well, there are. First of all, this is a big country. There's a lot of variation. We are always going to have people doing different things. It's possible that someone got a college degree and then decided they wanted to be a bartender. But even leaving that aside, what you see is you see a big pay boost in almost all of these different fields. How could it be that a retail worker or a clerk would make more with a college degree? Well, maybe they're more likely to be able to get a job at Trader Joe's. Maybe they're more likely to have a higher level clerk job that these sorts of government data can't pick up. The return to college, the numbers suggest, remain incredibly high. A separate report that came out around the same weekend, earlier this summer, that this did, tried to put an annual return on college, comparing it to real estate and stocks in recent decades. Real estate has had a return of less than 1% a year, annually, adjusted for inflation. Stocks have had a return of about 7%. College has a return of about 15%. Does all of this mean that education guarantees a good life? It obviously does not. As I said a minute ago, we've gone through a terrible recession. There are college graduates who are suffering badly. And I don't mean to suggest otherwise by saying that the average benefits are so high. More so, I think it's important for people who advocate for education to acknowledge that education is not everything. It will not guarantee a good life for everybody, and it is not in and of itself a solution. There are many other things that affect the living standards of people. And of middle-class households. Their ability to bargain for wages affects their wages and, by extension, their living standards. Their tax rates affect their wages and their living standards. The tax rates for the middle class have fallen much less than the tax rates of the very affluent, which has exacerbated the pre-tax earning trends. Keynes has said that in the long run, we're all dead, famously. So telling the people that education is the best in the long run isn't that useful for many of them. Many may have trained for one kind of work that no longer exists. Telling them that they would be better off if they had gotten a college degree or if they go back now does not solve all their problems. And I don't for a minute mean to suggest that it does. But I still think it's important to focus on the fact that nothing has a return quite like education. And I know that's why you're all here. You're here to think about how can the educational attainment and the educational institutions we have in this country improve. And I want to talk briefly at the end about 4 different ways that I see. The first two deal with the amount of resources that are available to education. The overall top-line resources that are available to education are determined by the taxes we pay, because so much of education is public sector. Right now, we are near the lowest level of taxes relative to the economy in about 50 years. It's around 15 or 16% of GDP. It hasn't been that low since the early 1960s or maybe even the 1950s. Some of that is simply a function of the fact that we're in a recession. When people are doing badly in a recession, they make less, they pay less in taxes. There have also been various tax cuts that have been put into place. So as the economy recovers, eventually, we should expect that some of that will spring back. But it will only spring back to something around the historical norm or maybe even slightly below it. You often hear people talk about taxes as if the norm should be that taxes don't rise over time. But there's a problem with that. We are an aging society, and we're a society that is becoming ever better at treating people. We're getting ever new ways to keep people alive and keep people healthy. When you combine those two things, it says that healthcare costs are going to go up a lot. And so, as a result, like many other rich countries over history, we are likely to follow something that's known as Wagner's Law among economists, which is that over time, rich countries tend to pay more in taxes because they want more of the goods that the market, as wonderful as the market is, will not provide on its own. The market won't provide firefighters on its own. It won't provide the military. It won't provide public schools. Many of these things do not return a profit, and the market will not provide it. But as you get rich, you want more of these luxuries. You want a really strong military. You want really good schools. You want a safety net that says to people, you know what? Even if you lose your job, you might be okay. Even though in the market, left alone to its own devices, you wouldn't be. You want a safety net. And that's why over time you see big increases over the long term, not in the short term, in the amount of taxes that a society pays. 100 years ago, we paid 2% of our GDP in federal taxes. Today, we're on course to get back to about 18%. None of us would argue that we were richer a century ago just because we didn't pay much in federal taxes. In fact, the federal taxes that we've paid have helped build the highway system. They created the internet at the Defense Department. There is a connection between public goods run well and prosperity. And so it seems to me that it will be very difficult for education to get the kinds of resources it needs to keep the United States in front if taxes don't rise. The kind of cuts that would be required to every other part of the government, to the military, to healthcare, would just be too severe. That doesn't mean there can't be cuts to these other kinds of government. We stand out among the nations of the world for spending vastly more per person on health than any other country. By some measures, we get better results. By other measures, we get worse results. We do better with cancer treatment. We do worse with medical errors. All told, there is no doubt that we do not get vastly better results than other countries. And so we are paying vastly more for somewhere between a little bit better and a little bit worse results. That suggests massive inefficiencies in our healthcare system. Likewise, we spend massive amounts of money on prisons and putting people in jail. That has had some benefits. Our crime rate has fallen remarkably so. I grew up in New York in the 1980s, and I was mugged twice. I don't think most teenagers growing up in New York today, hanging out where I did, are getting mugged. Many fewer people are getting killed in neighborhoods that are quite different from the ones that I grew up in. This has had huge benefits. But it's also had big costs, both human and financial. Similarly, we've made enormous promises on pensions to many public sector workers. These things, healthcare, prisons, pensions, they take money away from what we can spend on education. And so the first question for me about education is the overall level of resource and taxes. The second is the efficiency of government and how much money we are spending on things that do not lead to higher educational attainment and more economic growth. The third and the fourth have to do with education themselves. The 5-minute movie at the beginning that you heard touched on some of these. The truth is we just don't spend money that well on education. We have not constructed a system that is meant to succeed. And perhaps not shockingly, in many ways, it is not succeeding. We pay to put students in seats. We don't pay for students to succeed. We pay to colleges to enroll students, not to graduate students. We pay students to enroll, not to graduate. One of my favorite experiments that's happened recently has been in West Virginia. I believe there are some people here familiar with it. West Virginia has tweaked one of its scholarship programs to say that to remain eligible for this promised scholarship, you must remain on track to graduate in 4 years. If you get off that schedule, you lose the scholarship. I spent some time at one of the colleges, and the things that really struck me there was how much it had begun, only begun, it was not revolutionary, begun to affect the culture of the place. The students I talked to, many of them on the scholarship, viewed 4-year graduation as the norm, which of course in many places it no longer is. There's a great research paper on West Virginia by an economist named Judy Scott Clayton, that's Scott-Clayton, that is unusually well written for an economics paper, and is fascinating to boot. I would love to see much more of these kinds of experiments, not just on the margins either. I know there's now a growing list of states, including this one, that are doing some really interesting things, but the numbers tend to be tiny. They usually aren't punishing schools for doing badly. They're giving little extra benefits to schools that do well, and there's a difference between those two things. The final thing of the 4 is figuring out what students are actually learning. I know that graduation rates do not equal education. I think they are a very good measure of it, but they do not equal education. And the fact is we know shockingly little about how much students actually learn in college. Harvard tends to be at the top of those rankings with other schools like it, not because of anything it's actually doing during those 4 years, but simply because who goes there. We don't know what is happening from these incredibly well-funded 4-year universities all the way through the system, community colleges, state universities, about how much people are actually learning. Colleges have been very resistant on this question, and in that way, I think have harmed the cause of educational reform and progress. Despite all this, I'm actually optimistic that we can see some real improvement here. I'm optimistic in part because we've done it before. A century ago, the world's rich countries were trying to decide how much of their resources they should devote to education. At the time, high school was the frontier, not college. And people in Europe basically decided that it was a waste to send everyone to high school. How could you send everyone to high school? Everyone doesn't need a high school degree. The same sorts of things in other languages that we've heard in this country about college. Everyone shouldn't need to go to college. It is a waste if we do it for everyone. In this country, we chose a different path. We decided, no, it is not a waste to give everyone a high school education. And we led the world for a long time by a wide margin in educational attainment, largely as a result. Those high school graduates not only created the great white-collar businesses of the 20th century that you might typically associate with more education, the technology business, the biomedical business, the movie business, but they also made blue-collar companies, Caterpillar and General Motors, more efficient. It's one of the most surprising things about the Golden and Katz work, is the extent to which education helped the great American industrial economy succeed. It created the most prosperous economy in the world. And this remains, despite all of our problems, the most prosperous economy in the world. But there's no guaranteeing that it will, and in fact, I'd be pretty comfortable predicting that it will not if our educational system doesn't improve and figure out a way to remain among the world's very best and to be constantly improving. How likely are we to have such a system? I don't honestly know. I think it's very hard to know. On the one hand, I think there's reason for optimism. I think we see much more acceptance of some of these ideas of measuring accountability and measuring outcomes than we did, particularly in K through 12. If you looked at that graph on men and women, you see that, in fact, college graduation rates have ticked up in the last few years, so there are reasons for optimism. On the other hand, when you look into some of these big city school systems that have tried to reform, the evidence of great change is not so great. On the other hand, many colleges have dropout rates that are tremendously high, above 50%, sometimes above 60%, 70%, even when they are measured correctly, which I know is a big issue. The best thing I think we could say is that the last few years have raised the chances that we will create the kind of educational system that we need. But the outcome remains very much in doubt, worrisomely in doubt. And the outcome will have, I think in the long run, a greater effect on the future of the American economy than anything else. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you. Yeah? You want to do it, or do you want me to? Great. I can zap you, I guess.
Hi, my name is Louis Soares. I'm with the Center for American Progress. I'm just wondering, from your perch as a journalist, the effect that technology had on your industry. What do you think about the effects that technology can have on higher education? And will it be easy? Because it was fairly painful in your sector and continues to be painful. So I'm just curious.
I mainly am, I don't know much about technology and education and what it's likely to do. But a brief thing on journalism and technology. I'm actually, for my publication, very optimistic about the effect of technology. More people read us by a wide margin than ever before. Our journalism is more varied and I think more interesting and better than it ever used to be before. We can do things that we never used to be able to do in terms of interactive graphics, in terms of all kinds of things. We have to figure out the business model, which is no small challenge. Although there's been some really good news lately. Our digital subscriber plan is going quite well. There's still a lot of difficulty ahead, and the problems for other publications are much bigger than they are for us. We are very lucky to be able to have a national audience. There are not many. I worry much more about local papers and whether they can remain in the role that they have remained in as watchdogs, as local sources of information and education, and as a newspaper lover, as a daily miracle, as people like to say. But I think technology's role for journalism has been mixed, partly good, partly worrisome. I don't buy a lot of the hype about online education with college. I think sometimes it seems like one of these easy fixes. But I also don't doubt that there are big inefficiencies in the system now, as Marilyn discovered. And I don't doubt that technology will be a very big part of that solution. It's just not at all clear to me, based on the 3 or 4 studies that I have spent some time with on the effects of online education. I'm worried we're going to essentially outsource improvement to technology, and it usually doesn't work that way.
I hear you making 2 points, one of which is people with college degrees are better off than those without. I think it's pretty well established. And then you directly confront this other question, which is that causal or is it correlative? And you seem to just really discount or reject the correlation part. And I wonder, you know, are you overselling that? Because surely there's some selection bias. You've mentioned Harvard. And I think it would be a clear example. You yourself said it's kind of unclear whether they actually learn anything. They're just picking really good people. Where I'm in California, you have to be in the top 1/8 of high school grads just to get to the University of California. So 7/8 of our high school graduates aren't eligible. So can you really ascribe all of that benefit to some value added from going through college?
Definitely not all of it. So the question is, can you ascribe a significant amount of it, enough so that its return remains strongly positive? And with the caveat that there is no way to know for sure, I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So I didn't talk about them, but there are studies that have attempted to do exactly that. They look at two groups of kids who look very similar, one of whom lived quite near to a college growing up, and one of whom, the second group, did not live near to a college. For kids who are sort of on the margin of deciding whether to go to college, proximity can have a big effect, right? I'm sure you all can imagine that. For some kids, it will have no effect whatsoever, but for a sizable number of kids, it will really have a big effect. And so what you can then try to do is treat that as a natural experiment, and you can see, did the kids who lived nearer to college, were they more likely to go to college? In fact, they were. You can try to control for their characteristics, like their high school grades and their SAT scores, and then you can try to say, okay, to what extent do we think their college education played a role in their higher earnings? That study and several other studies along these lines have found very strongly that there is an independent effect of education, what appears to be a causal effect. Tyler Cowen recently had a nice blog post on this on his blog Marginal Revolution, in which he talked about the signaling effect, which is basically to some extent the opposite. And so the research strongly points in the direction that it does have an effect. It's not all, it's not everything. I am sure that if you took a lot of really smart kids and barred them from going to college, many of them would still do quite well. But I do think there remains, on average and on the margin, a really substantial effect. It's not just that proximity study. There's ones on Vietnam War veterans and trying to use different things basically to separate out the effect that college has. I would also point out that people vote with their behavior and with their wallets on this question. The people who you hear out there most skeptical about college education send their kids to college. There are not people out there who are saying, you know what? There are not sizable numbers of people out there who are saying, you know what? I've looked at all the evidence. College is a big old waste of money. And I'm just going to take my talented 18-year-old self or my talented 18-year-old kid and get them a head start in the world right now, rather than wasting all their time.
Men's pay falling and women's pay increasing. And you gave a little throwaway line and said, because women aren't taking low-paying jobs like teaching anymore.
In the same numbers.
In the same numbers. Since the students who come to us are directly affected by the quality of the teachers who teach them in the K-12 schools, what kind of comments, recommendations, ideas do you have about solving this problem?
It's a great point. I mean, there really is the terrible discrimination against women that continues, but was much, much worse in earlier decades, had this strange unintended consequence, right? Which is that it took all these incredibly bright, well-qualified people and told them that one of their few options for work was teaching our young people. And wow, did that have some incredibly positive unintended consequences. And thank goodness we don't have the benefits of that kind of discrimination anymore, but we also don't have the unintended consequences. I think attracting more talented people into teaching and keeping talented people in teaching and making people who are already in teaching better, because you don't emerge from the womb or from college with some sort of immutable teaching talent, is probably the most important thing out there. That's certainly what one piece of research after another has suggested. I think money probably plays some role in that, which again comes back to my first 2 points. Money doesn't grow on trees, right? And so obviously to have higher paid teachers, we need higher taxes, or we need to be spending less money on the things that our taxes are now going to: healthcare, worker pensions, prisons, you name it. I don't know exactly how to do that. It does seem to me to be a good thing that the debate is so much more focused on this notion than it used to be. That so much more of the debate is focused on the question of how do we get good people and keep good people and make good people in the classroom, and basically to some extent try to recreate this incredible female-dominated teaching corps that we had for so long.
Thanks very much, David. I'm Dan McInerney from Utah State University. Much of your talk focused on some differences in gender and the heartening effects of education on breaking down some long-standing gender divisions and barriers. Can you, in thinking about the takeaway message we all bring back with us from this conference, do you also have some encouraging word from us, some kind of measurable effects on the way education may hopefully be breaking down some long-standing racial barriers?
Not as hopeful. I'm wary of citing numbers that I don't know as well, but there has been much less change there. One of the really dispiriting things when you look at measures of racial inequality over the last couple decades is just how little has changed. The income gap, the education gap, many of these things have improved a little bit. The gaps have shrunk a little bit, or in some cases, they've actually widened. Incarceration rates, clearly the gaps have widened. I wrote a column last year about the somewhat counterintuitive finding that the gap in self-reported happiness has actually shrunk significantly. So the gap, whites report being much happier than African Americans, but the gap is not nearly as big as it used to be, which I think is one sign that the sort of efforts we've had to reduce discrimination have had some effects in society, which certainly seems like they should, and in some ways is an encouraging message amidst a lot of news that is less encouraging. But most of the encouraging stories about breaking down racial gaps in education are stories. That doesn't make them encouraging. They still can be incredibly encouraging, but they are encouraging as models for things that can be adopted rather than as society-wide changes.
In an effort to save my gender here, so we're at Lumina and other places increasingly focused on that adult population that has not gotten educated
Yes.
to this point, and the need to find ways productively, but in terms of to get them back into college. So I guess two questions. One from a journalistic perspective, both for in the journalistic world and in the policy world. Despite what the numbers tell us, which is in the majority of states, we can't get to where we need to be without going after that population. There's still an amazing lack of attention to that population. We're still thinking about those 18-year-olds coming up through the pipeline. Your thoughts on why and how that we break that barrier. And the other is there are we seeing emerging evidence, and maybe this is so recent we can't, but it seems to me it would be useful to begin to look at the impact on the variables you're looking at, like wages, when these people do, as they begin to go back in larger numbers, 30, 40 years old, even 50 years old, given we're all going to be working till we're 80 now, to look at that and see what is that different? Is there greater impact or is there lesser impact? So one sort of a will-building awareness, role of media question, and the other is sort of another question to ask about the impact of college, 2 and 4 year, et cetera, on another kind of population that's getting there late.
That's a really interesting point. I haven't seen any research on trying to look at a group of people who, say, have all been laid off from a company and then trying to figure out what's happened to the ones who've gone back to school and what's happened to the ones who have not. Obviously, the history of worker retraining is not the world's most uplifting history, right? A lot of programs have failed. And so I think a lot of people, that's one of the resistances that you see out there to talking about this subject. A lot of people feel like, ugh, the retraining thing again. There are all these examples of it not working. No matter what, people who lose their jobs in their 40s and 50s and 60s face often a brutal economic penalty even with it. But of course, what's the alternative, right? I mean, the alternative is having many of these people go years without work. The alternative is having large numbers of them go on to disability, which is becoming a kind of shadow unemployment program in this country. I mean, it is incredible that we now have close to 1 in 5 prime-age men, close to 1 in 5 men between the ages of 25 and 54 are not working at all. That doesn't include the people who want full-time work and can't get it. That is period. That includes the officially unemployed and the people who've dropped out of the workforce. And to some extent, that reflects on the failure of exactly this issue. So I don't have any perfect solutions for how to focus people on it, but I do think it's a really intriguing way to kind of go after this question of what effect does education have. When does it work and when does it not, right? It's not, to talk about your earlier question, it's not simply a matter of we put people into college and then everything's honky-dory, right? There are vast differences between colleges that are actually teaching people and colleges that aren't, colleges that are graduating people and colleges that aren't. Why do we have so much trouble shifting from the 18 to 22-year-old population? I would imagine there are a variety of reasons. One, it's what we're used to talking about. Two, it is a conceptually simpler problem to solve, and we are still so far from having solved it, right? If only our problem was that, you know what, we basically had gotten all the 22-year-olds who were capable of being college graduates through college, and now we needed to turn to everyone else, and we weren't able to do it. The fact is that we still have an enormous amount of work that needs to be done in those earlier years that are the more traditional sense. I'm sure that distracts some of the attention as well. I'll go to my final slide. This is my attempt to end on an up note, which is sort of an up note wrapped in a down note, or maybe it's a down note wrapped in an up note. This is the percentage of age group of countries in the OECD that have a kind of degree that OECD has a technical name for, but is basically bachelor's degrees or higher. You will see the one country that stands out here for basically making no progress between the current group of 55 and 64-year-olds and the current group of 25 to 34-year-olds, which is to say, over the last 30 or so years, is the United States, right? That's right there, right? Virtually no progress. Everyone else, you're seeing a big difference between how much education people in their 50s and 60s have and how much education people in their 20s and 30s have. Germany's sort of intriguing. It kind of suggests that maybe there is this model with apprenticeships and stuff like that. But Germany, I think, is more of an exception than anything else. These other countries show that it is possible to educate vastly more people than we're now educating, just as we showed in the past that it was possible to get many more people through high school. And so I think when you look at this, when you look at women, when you look at different religious groups, when you look at certain states, the message you see again and again and again is this is hard. There are no nicely wrapped, easy solutions. It's often expensive, but it's also doable. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, David, for those very clear and compelling remarks. We're just thrilled by the insights that you've offered us. I can't help but observe something about David that I forgot to mention in my introduction of him, which is that despite the fact that he's one of the nation's leading authorities and clearest thinkers and writers about economic issues, he's in fact not an economist. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in applied mathematics. And I think it is probably a good example of the fact that he didn't wake up when he got his BS in mathematics and search the want ads looking for a job in applied math. He ended up with diverse skills that allowed him to think critically, to be analytical, to problem solve, and he appears to have landed on his feet with that degree from that school in New Haven called Yale University. Also, by the way, thank you for, I can't speak for Orthodox Jews, but thank you for including Orthodox Christians, of which I am one, since we're often rounding errors in those charts. We are going to take a brief break, and we'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.